to address formulations like do you accept the state of Israel as it is, because those formulations tend to pigeonhole you in one category or another. So just allow me a couple of minutes,
okay.
I'll keep myself brief, to try to explain my answer.
Okay.
Number one, Israel exists as a state, and in my view, it has the same rights and responsibilities as any other state in the state system. Number two, that does not mean in any way, from my point of view at any rate, that it legitimizes the way the state was established. In my view, the way in which the state was established plainly violates the most ordinary and basic norms of human rights. It was established by dispossessing the indigenous population. So to say that it has the right to exist presently does not, in my view at any rate, make any kind of judgment on its historical origins, which, as I say, at least I see it, as being plainly in violation of the most ordinary norms of human rights. Having said that, we have to remember that, for example, the state in which I live, namely the United States, was also established by violating the most ordinary norms of human rights, namely the dispossession of the indigenous population. Nonetheless, in my view, it also has the right to exist. And that leads me to my third point. To say that the state has the right to exist does not mean does not mean that you're validating the precise way in which it exists. So, for example, the United States before 1865, in my view, had the right to exist. That doesn't mean I'm validating slavery. In the same way, I think Israeli Jews have the right to self-determination, but that does not mean, in my view, that I'm validating a discriminatory state that puts Palestinians either in second-class citizenship or denies them the basic right of return to their homeland. So to say that in summary, to say that I think the state of Israel has the right to exist does not mean I'm giving a historical judgment on that state or a future judgment on that state.
Do you want to comment on that, Mark?
Well, rather than commenting directly, because Norman has covered the ground quite well, I think, it's very interesting theologically, it's very interesting historically, but the question we're really facing in 1997 is, do the Palestinians have the right to a truly independent state which is going to coexist with the Israeli state? The Israeli state will evolve further. There is no constitution at the moment. But unfortunately, the idea of a two-state settlement, which is what most of the world has been debating for the last couple of decades, and which the UN has busily passed probably more resolutions on than any other subject, that is the topic of the moment. And unfortunately, the direction that we're moving for the past few years in the guise of what is called the peace process is precisely a plan by the United States, by Israel, by the American Jewish community, which is extremely powerful here, and I agree with Mohammed that there has never been a president of the United States as pro-Israeli as this one. In fact, he has pretty much turned over to the Jewish lobby, including putting Jewish lobby people in major positions, policy regarding the Middle East. So in that entire picture, what we're really dealing with in 1997 is whether there is going to be an independent Palestinian state. And it certainly looks like there is not under the circumstances that we're dealing with, and that the peace process, quote unquote, is specifically designed to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, even if something should emerge that Yasser Arafat will declare to be a state. Its attributes will be much closer to Bantustan's than to independence.
Okay, I'd just like to remind the listeners that you are listening to Radio 786 on 100.4 FM, that we're having a panel discussion on Israel past, present and future. And on the line from the United States we have Dr. Norman Finkelstein, Mr. Mark Bruzonsky, and from the UK, Imam Muhammad Al-Asi. In the studios we have Imam Ahmad Qasim and Mr. Keith Gottschalk. Keith,
if I may just make one brief comment in response to Mark's observation,
okay,
and trying to connect it with your question. I think the issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict is becoming more and more close to the issue in South Africa. The issue in South Africa was not whether South Africa had a right to exist. The issue was whether South Africa was going to be a democratic state. And I think in the case of Israel-Palestine, we're moving in the same direction. The issue is no longer whether Israel has the right to exist, but the question is whether there can be an arrangement in the area which will allow for full and equal rights for Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And I think the direction, again, is very similar to the South Africa. The only resolution of the conflict which will allow for full and equal rights for Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs is a democratic state, as in the South African case, because the closest the Palestinians will get, or the most the Palestinians will get, is Bantustans. That falling short of a genuinely democratic solution, it seems to me that the democratic proposals, as they evolved in South Africa, will become more and more relevant in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then I hope the issue will not be whether or not Israel exists. The issue will be, as it was in South Africa, full and equal rights for all citizens.
Okay, that's some interesting remarks that you've got there. Keith, how do you feel about that?
I'd like to look at questions of equity and reciprocity. Two persons who say the State of Israel has a right to exist. The mirror image is, should there not be therefore a sovereign state of Palestine? Many states in the world, of course, have a dimension of settler colonialism in their constitution, from South Africa to the USA, and Israel and the Palestine Mandate back to the 1880 modern Zionist movement is clearly an example of that. Questions of dispossession and human rights, to my mind, come up as more important than the current, whether a state does or doesn't exist. Now, believers and others have different concepts of human rights, but taking, for example, for the moment, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one must expect Israel and Palestine to address matters such as agrarian dispossession, seizure of land, which has been going on in Israel continuously since 1948, and for about 30 years also in the West Bank Gaza Strip, and even in occupied parts of other countries such as Syria and formerly Egypt. South Africa has a land commission at the moment to return land seized on ethnic grounds from the conquered and allocated to the conqueror. Equally important as land, although land has a symbolic value in politics, is water rights. And South Africa's government has had to give a lot of attention to restitution of this. And there's been great controversy, which the Journal of Palestine Studies had looked at, how every Israeli action for not wishing to return to Syria, the eastern shore of Lake Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, to what's been going on in the West Bank, is connected with monopolizing water. At the moment, Israel, as other governments in that area, has banning orders without trial, no due process, as our American friends say, house arrest, detention without trial. The Christian Palestinian Fouzi el-Asma was openly told, for example, that he will be detained without trial forever until he gets some country to accept that he will emigrate, and he bore no arms. The Israeli jurists have tainted their law system by publishing in law journals legal justifications for torture, and the Israeli courts, more brazenly than the apartheid ones, have legitimated what they call, quote, a moderate degree of torture, unquote, in interrogating Palestinian detainees. Under this, South Africans will note, and I gather one of Radio 786's staff is a daughter of the late Imam Abdullah Harun, several Palestinian detainees have been moderately killed under this moderate degree of torture. And I think addressing these wrongs is a major point. To say that Israel has no constitution, well, in the British sense, that's true, it hasn't got one book, but it's been under a state of emergency for over half a century. And in that sense, a state of emergency is Israel's constitution.
Imam Ahmad, you've lived under apartheid, and you've also recently called for the dissolution of the State of Israel. How do you feel about that question?
Shukran. I think firstly, when one says that the issue of how Israel was established is not at stake here, obviously that is the major question, because the claim that the United Nations actually established the State of Israel is a total fallacy. The State of Israel was established by terrorist groups like the Palmach, Irgun and Haganah, and it is by driving off the Palestinian people off their land that they actually managed to establish the State of Israel. So not only was the State of Israel established by terrorism and through terrorism, but its official policy is actually terrorism. A recent communique from the United States of America by Advocate Linda Breyer, who is the Executive Legal Director of the Society of St. Ives in Jerusalem, indicates that a settlement known as Jahalim had just been attacked by Israeli police. And she says a military operation was carried out, and I rather like a comment here where she says, it was so pathetic, ordinary human beings, unarmed and unprotected, whose only crime was that they were not Jewish, and who had lived in one place for many years, had all traces of their habitation removed within a matter of less than an hour. Now that statement, they were oppressed, exploited, genocide is conducted against it because they were not Jewish. That is the essence of the question. So it is definitely an issue. We cannot simply argue that because it's a de facto state, therefore we are going to have this situation. And the parallels might very well be there with South Africa, but in the South African case, we outnumbered the settlers by at least 40-1, if not more. Now, in the case of Israel, you are actually continuing to import settlers who have no link whatsoever with Palestinian soil, and obviously not allocating the same rights, whether democratic or not, to the rest of the population. And obviously there's no right of return for the approximately 4 million Palestinians, whereas any Jew anywhere in the world can walk into the State of Israel and be accepted as a citizen. So the parallels with the apartheid regime is they were both racist, they were both chauvinistic, they were both exclusivistic, and of course they are both expansionist, because that is the only way in which Israel can survive, and that is on a war-based economy. And had Israel not been a tool of imperialism within the Middle East, it is doubtful whether Israel would have survived after 4 or 5 years. So it goes beyond the mere de facto existence of the State of Israel. Two other questions crop up immediately. One is, there is a distinction between legality and legitimacy. Anything can be made legal by any government at any time, but legitimacy essentially means that which admits of reason, and the existence of the State of Israel does not admit of reason. Secondly, we have a question in the back of our minds: do oppressors actually have a right to exist? Because by saying it's a de facto state, we're in fact saying that an oppressive state has the right to exist.
Imam Al-Asi?
Yes.
You've, I'm sure, sort of started this latest circuit in your previous comment. How do you feel about that? The state of, whether the State of Israel exists or not, should exist or not?
Well, I think the way the Israelis have been defining themselves, not in their books, but the way they've been defining themselves in human behavior, if that's the definition of Israel, excluding others because they are not of the Jewish faith, finding it legal to do horrible things to them. I mean, this is not the time to, I guess, go through the many things that have been done to the Palestinians, but I guess all of us have enough information to know what I'm talking about. If that is the definition of self-determination, then that type of definition doesn't have the right to exist. And by extension, the State of Israel doesn't have the right to exist. But I think the whole issue has to be bounced back into the internal psychology of the Jews themselves, especially those who find some sympathy with Israel, whatever that is. And the question here becomes, can they find it within themselves to come up with a definition of political expression? Let's not call it nation-state here. Political expression that can make room for others to live and let live. I can't answer that question very accurately within the dimensions of Jewish psychology. This is strictly up to those who come from the Jewish background, the Jewish faith, Jewish history, etc., to make clear to us who are not of that dimension whether that is possible or not. If we were to take the details of the past 50 years of Israeli history, everything is screaming at us and telling us, no, that is not possible. Our self-determination means we do this. We kill, we alienate, we throw people out of their homes, we destroy their homes, we deny them their rights, we deny them citizenship, we deny them equality. All of these things have been played out in 50 years. And as we are on the receiving end of all of this, we say to them, as a response, you should not exist in this form. Now, this should solicit some type of response from them. Okay, if we aren't to exist like this, then we will exist like this. Okay, how should you exist? We want to know.
Yeah.
I mean, our history is one in comparison. The Muslims and even the Christian Arabs of the Middle East, our history has been one of inclusivity, if you will, one that includes others. That's why we have so many quote-unquote minorities in the area that have lived along from time immemorial, because we didn't have policies of eradication. The Israelis, in the way they've been behaving in their nation-state structure, have been pursuing policies of eradication. And that makes no room for recognition. We can't recognize policies of eradication.
Thank you, Imam Al-Asi. Norman.
May I add something?
Yes, Norman. I was actually going to come back to you because I think you started to address that kind of investigation into the psyche of whether or not one can. Yes, can continue.
I don't actually disagree with anything I've heard. My problem with it is that we're dealing on a theoretical and historical level. And I kind of feel the need to bring some practicality back to this. Whatever my views as an American person of Jewish origin, I know the Israeli society pretty well, and I also know the American Jewish society pretty well. Whatever ideal solution there might be in form of a democratic state where everybody would be equal, the great majority of the Israelis, and also a sizable chunk of the American Jewish community that's extremely powerful, have no interest in any way in something less than a Jewish state. The debate that goes on among them is what kind of a Jewish state is it going to be? What kinds of restrictions? What role for the religious? What role for... And that is the debate that is going on within Jewish society. Now, you're not just dealing with a religion when you deal with Judaism. You're dealing also with something that borders on, for many people, an ethnicity. And you're also dealing, I have to stress this again, even though I'm the only one who has mentioned it, this is the post-Holocaust world. It is still the world where the parents and the grandparents remember the powerlessness of the Jewish community just a short time ago. They still remember the world where you couldn't go to country clubs, where you didn't get admitted to universities and fraternities because you were, quote-unquote, Jewish. Now, in that situation, the Jewish world is not interested in being a minority community within, Muhammad just mentioned the idea that the Islamic world has been very broad and minorities have lived, including thriving Jewish communities in Iraq, in Egypt, in Morocco, pre-Zionism. So the realities as I see them for the foreseeable future, I'm talking about the next 10 to 20 years, are that the Jewish community will be debating what kind of an Israel, but when they say Israel, they mean Jewish state. So for me, the issue then is what is going to happen to Palestinians. I personally would prefer a democratic and secular model, but it's not up to me. I'm living here in the United States and am no longer representing Jewish organizations. So under these circumstances, for us to go down this theoretical road and not realize that the Israelis are prepared to fight for a Jewish state. They're even prepared to do things like the Samson complex, which Seymour Hersh has written about, which would be destroy themselves and others in a process if that state were challenged. Now, Norman and I have some differences in perspective on this, but what would, if I may throw out a question, what would be the Islamic reaction and what would be the reaction of the other panelists if, in fact, the current peace process were to end and the idea of corralling Palestinians in city-type reservations on using the concept of autonomy, what if that were to collapse and instead we were to return to the UN 242 resolutions and to the idea of an independent Palestinian state and an independent Jewish Israeli state?
I'll return to that in 1/2 moment. I want to just briefly comment on 2 previous issues, and I'll return to Mark's question. This is Norm Finkelstein speaking. I don't think the issue is the Jewish psyche. My own view is, if you look at history across time and across space, the actions of the Israelis vis-a-vis the Palestinians is not very much unlike the actions of many racist colonialisms, many ethnic colonialisms. Certainly the similarities with the American conquest of the West are obvious, and frankly the similarities, I think, with the conquest of South Africa by the European settlers are obvious. So I think to try to find the answer to the enigma of the Middle East in the Jewish psyche is, at least to my thinking, it's off the mark, it's wrong-headed. Secondly, I don't entirely agree with Mark when he speaks about the Jewish sensibility being post-Holocaust, as if to say one derives only a single set of possible lessons from the Nazi Holocaust. So, for example, Mark said it's not too long ago that Jews weren't admitted to country clubs, Jews were discriminated in universities, and presumably he would have added, it's not too long ago that Jews suffered from pogroms, and in fact suffered even worse, rather worse than pogroms during World War II. The question is, do those facts mean necessarily that you become a Zionist, or that you become at any rate apologetic of what Israel does? My view is quite the contrary. Both my parents experienced the very worst in Poland before World War II, and then my father in Auschwitz and my mother in Majdanek during World War II. So they experienced the very worst imaginable that Jews could experience during that period, short of their own death, leaving aside that their entire families were exterminated. But they came out of the experience, that is to say, their post-Holocaust consciousness was to be appalled at any discrimination, to be appalled at any assaults on minority groups, to be appalled at what Israel does and did to the Palestinians. So it doesn't necessarily follow in the post-Holocaust world that you become either a Zionist or an apologist for discriminatory attitudes. You may come out of the Holocaust with exactly the reverse sensibility. Having said that, let me now turn to the question Mark raises. Nobody can predict with any certainty how the Israel-Palestine conflict will be resolved, assuming it has a resolution. My own sense is that looking at the facts that have been created on the ground, it's unlikely that a two-state settlement is any longer in the cards. It may be, I may be proven wrong. If it's no longer in the cards, we can't simply say that...